Good evening, everybody. We welcome once again Dr. David Bradshaw and all of you to St. Athanasius for part 3 of 4 in our study of Kyle Harper's book, From Shame to Sin. And Dr. David, without further ado, please lead away.
Thank you, Father. Well, I actually, before I dive into this chapter, I was going to make a quick plug for another book that if you like this book, okay, you'll love this other one, because this book we're discussing, of course, is by a classicist, full of information. Can be a little dry. You know, one of our number was telling me how he was falling asleep reading this chapter. So I can understand. This other book is one you would never fall asleep reading, I think. It's a novel. It's called A Crown of Life, a novel of the Great Persecution, being the persecution under Diocletian. And happens to be written by an Orthodox deacon in Rocourt, Brian Patrick Mitchell. And to tell you the truth, I picked it up partly because I know him casually and I just wanted to see what it was like. Found it to be just a great book, a really engrossing story. Mary and I read it together. And what I love about it is that it sort of puts you there and makes that world come alive. You know, you see what it was like to be a pagan and how conversion could happen, even in the midst of persecution, and often, you know, a slow, painful process. But and what the persecution also was like, and then, you know, some of the scenes are set at the court of Constantine. So you're sort of, you travel from the highest point of society to the lowest, and see this transformation taking place. So anyway, and it's, you know, it's beach reading. It really is a great story that just draws you along. Well, okay.
What years is the novel encompassed, Doctor?
Early 300s. It goes up through the victory of Constantine at Milvian Bridge, which was 312, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, 311. Okay, so maybe right after that. And
Edict of Milan, or no?
No. Yeah, so it starts with the persecution, which I think began.
Diocletian?
Yeah, like 299 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so at that period. All right, so getting back to our book, the book by Kyle Harper, From Shame to Sin. Tonight we're on chapter 3 called Church, Society, and Sex in the Age of Triumph. So this is the Age of Triumph, of course, being the conversion of Constantine and the century, or maybe even 2 centuries following that, when Christianity became slowly the dominant religion in the empire, and ultimately, after I believe it was Theodosius who closed the pagan temples, the only legal religion in the empire. So it's a triumph in that sense, but that doesn't mean that things were simple or easy or straightforward in sort of the day-to-day level of how people live, what morals they lived by, and what society was like. So he's describing this chapter, you know, the long, painful struggle to Christianize pagan society from the deepest levels up. He calls it a battle that had to be fought parish by parish against fornication and all the sort of associated sins, because as we've talked about, porneia, the word is translated fornication, primarily meant prostitution, but also had other implications, free sex with slaves, for example, and the use of erotic art in public that was widespread, and so forth. And all of that was tied into the way of life, the use of the slaves, the exploitation of slaves, that was so endemic to the whole ancient society. Well, all right, so in this chapter, there are at least 3 or 4 major topic areas. First one dealing with the treatment of homosexuality. Second one with marriage and divorce, and also sort of what is marriage in general, what's the value of marriage in relation to the monastic life, virginity, which of course the church valued highly. And then the third section of the chapter is about what he considers to be ways in which the church becoming dominant, coming into power in some position of political influence, posed new challenges that hadn't been there before, and led the church to, in some ways, to qualify or even to backtrack on its belief in free will. Now, I think that's putting it that way is a little too simple, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's just take them in order. So, the homosexuality, obviously important subject for us today. Well, one thing to bear in mind is that, and we've talked about this before, the Romans had a very nuanced attitude. They didn't consider it to be wrong in general. What they considered to be wrong were two things: either seducing a freeborn boy or playing the passive role as an adult. So those were actually illegal under Roman law from the time of Cicero. That was news to me. I hadn't realized that. Not always strictly prohibited, but anyone known to do one of those two things could be subject to loss of property and loss of social status, was not eligible to hold certain offices, and so on. Well, so it's against that background that the Christian teaching has to be seen as sort of partly in continuity, but also having a different foundation. And this we also touched on last week, the teaching of St. Paul that same-sex intercourse is against nature. Now, that phrase itself is not revolutionary because, as I mentioned, Plato says something similar in the Laws. And there are other pagan authors who say so. Ellie?
Was there a difference between the Romans' attitude and the Greeks' attitude toward that? Is there any significant difference we should know about?
Well, earlier I think there was. The Romans called it Greek love. So in their minds, this was a Greek thing, at least initially. And it wasn't the sort of thing that hard, freeborn Roman men went in for. But by this time, by the 2nd or 3rd century AD, those differences are pretty well washed out, I think. Because Roman society has been heavily Hellenized in a lot of ways. The old saying is captive Greece took captor Rome captive because they, although they were subordinate politically, they were dominant culturally. The idea of being against nature, just to get back to that, you can find that in a lot of pagan authors, but he does point out that for Christians it had a kind of a moral weight to it and gravity that it didn't for the pagans. There's an interesting passage in Ovid in the Metamorphoses that he doesn't mention, but it's worth looking at. I think it's in Book 8, toward the end of that book. And it's the story of two young lovers. One of them is a teenage girl. The other is also a girl, but she's dressed as a boy, and the first girl takes her for a boy. And they fall in love. And this passage is sort of the complaint of the second one, the one who's dressed as a boy, that she knows she can't go into this because it's against nature. And what that means in the context of the story is not exactly that it's wrong, it's that it's futile and can never lead to lasting happiness. And she's aware of that, and it's a very bitter thing for her. And I think that would be the more typical Roman attitude, not exactly a moral condemnation per se, but a sense that, it's unnatural nonetheless. Well, all right, so...
You alluded there to Romans 1, said it was against nature. And you said that wasn't particular to Paul. Was his other contribution there in terms of burning with passion or desire towards one another, is that unique to Paul, or is there a precedent for that as well?
Yeah, as far as I know, that is, right. And the whole context that he puts it in as a consequence of the alienation from God, of which the first consequence, the first sign is idolatry. And then God gives them up, right? And then they descend further into sin. That whole context is new, definitely. So that's why I think it has such gravity and moral weight for Christianity that it didn't for the pagans. Well, so you can see some signs of that, and these are sort of what he goes through in the development of Christian legislation, both within the church canonically and also as it influenced Roman law. He mentions the canons of Elvira. That was a council in the early 300s, in which one of the few sins for which there could be no penance that would ever readmit one to communion, it was a permanent lifetime excommunication, was that of violating boys, seducing boys, and no distinction between slave or free. Okay, it was simply violating boys. He mentions St. Basil assigns a 15-year penance for what he calls shameful acts with males. Again, no distinction, of whether you're active or passive or anything like that. St. John Chrysostom, now some of you may have, if you've ever been taken an interest in this, you may have looked at his homily on that passage in Romans 1. Read it sitting down, maybe with a drink in your hand, because it's real fire and brimstone stuff. He goes even beyond St. Paul in some ways, because he says that the desire itself, he says it's a kind of disease, and that the desire, feeds upon the act, and the act then feeds the desire, and it becomes a destructive cycle. So, no question that the preaching against homosexuality was very powerful and consistent. It didn't follow that, just because you have a Christian emperor, therefore he's going to enact all that in law, because this was embedded in the society, and there were limits to what the emperor could do. He does quote here a law of Constans, who was, I believe, one of the sons of Constantine, in 342. And I'll just read this if you don't mind, because the language gives you a sense that sort of that sense of the gravity is starting to enter into the Roman mind.
Which page, Doctor?
152. It's the one that Harper refers to it as the florid law, because the language is so florid. Here's what the law says. When a man couples in the manner of a woman, that is, as a woman who will have granted men what they want, when sex has lost its place, when there is a crime it is best not to know, when Venus is changed into another form, when love is sought but not seen, we command the laws to rise up and justice to be armed with an avenging sword, so that those infamous persons who are or will be guilty shall be subjected to exquisite penalties. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Congress used language like that today? But I don't think so. Well, obviously there's a lot of moral force and impetus there. Exactly what the exquisite penalties are, he doesn't say, and we actually don't know. So it's not clear what the practical force of that was. What we do know is that in 390, Theodosius, who was much more consistent and thoroughgoing in trying to implement Christian reforms, burnt all the male brothels. Okay, they were male brothels as well as female. And also had the male prostitutes burned publicly as an example to others. It's a famous act, and obviously made a big impression, okay, at the time and later. So that's one way in which you can see this becoming a very serious issue, even in terms of Roman law. There's sort of a further legal evolution. It's interesting that even Theodosius, though... I don't want to confuse the homosexuality with a prostitution. They're sort of linked, but let's treat them separately. So for homosexuality, then, the completion sort of that story is under Justinian in the early 6th century, who decreed the death penalty for two sins, one being adultery and the other being same-sex intercourse.
Adultery.
Yeah, that's page 155, I think.
Did murder already carry a death penalty at that time?
I believe so, yeah. I mean, he doesn't mention it, but I would assume it did. And actually, believe it or not, when he says death by the sword, that's not necessarily the worst punishment there could be in ancient law. Right? There were the Romans were masters of the long, painful death. So, but he decreed death by the sword for those.
Did the church through the centuries retain that permanent excommunication?
Basil the Great himself doesn't.
Yeah.
Elvira was kind of a strange council. It was very, very strict in a lot of ways, much more strict than what the rest of the church had kind of come to consensus about, and a lot of it was just ignored.
It's not referred to as an ecumenical council.
Yeah.
It's a local council.
It's
interesting.
It doesn't even have a whole lot of weight in the Latin either, which is where the council is actually held. So, even as a local council, its influence is very small.
I did look up in the Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium, which is a great source. If you ever just wonder how did the Byzantines treat a given subject or issue. So I looked up homosexuality in there just to see some of the later history. And these laws remained in force, the laws of Justinian, not always necessarily strictly enforced. And it remained as sort of a recurrent issue that would bubble up from time to time. It was a common accusation politically, a good way to slander somebody was to say that he was a secret homosexual. One of the other contexts that came up was in monastic rules. And a lot of Byzantine monasteries, in order to prevent this, prohibited men without beards from entering the monastery, or at least from taking vows as monks. And that would include two groups, either those too young to have a beard, but also eunuchs. And one of the emperors actually established a separate monastery just for eunuchs, because they were regarded as sort of a class apart. Which I wonder if that's one of the reasons why it's so traditional always to have a beard in Orthodox, if you're a monk.
Well, it's interesting. Saint Pachomius' rule includes, and I don't know if it follows Benedict's or not, but he has a rule. Men are not allowed on the men's cell. It's strict. It's next to the rule about not having women. But it's clear that there's the temptation there, and nip in the bud right now.
Yeah. So. Well, I think still in.
If memory serves, even back in 1 Timothy, when you're talking about the leadership of the church, the word that's used for elder there carries the connotation of the bearded ones.
Presbytery?
Yeah, and then how it's described after that. So.
Yeah.
But again,
back on the question of civil, you said the accusation would be made against political opponents. Any accusation of that gravity would automatically disqualify someone for running for office, which is why it's recorded in the Codex Justinianus, which is the law of Justinian, that any accusation like that would actually disqualify you from even running. So you could make an accusation like that. It would be very hard to prove, but the mere accusation of it would actually cause you to be ineligible to run. But interestingly enough, in the law it says that the sons of the person accused are still free to run. There was apparently some dispute about whether or not if a father was accused of homosexuality, whether his son could run.
Of course, I'm not sure how many free elections they had anyway, right? And the emperors.
Dr. David.
It was more for a lower level.
Yeah.
There's this interesting reference to infamia, infamy, and I was wondering, he doesn't really clarify how much of this system was retained after the Christian conversion. It would seem to not be incompatible with what we're hearing. But he says this: the use of infamia survived into the imperial period. Never a perfectly systematic concept, it entailed civil disabilities, especially limits on the ability to hold office or to access public legal remedies. If we judge simply by the legal debris that survives in the late codifications of Roman law, infamia appears to have relatively little bite. In fact, the only specific disability that we can be sure was applied to men who willingly submitted to sexual penetration was the ineligibility to apply as a public magistrate on someone else's behalf. I don't know what that means, but anyway.
Yeah.
A lot of heretics are actually in that category as well.
That charge, you mean?
Heretics that had, it was not all heresy. It was groups of heretics who had animosity towards another group. They would use the court system to try to abuse them with accusations. And so they actually were permitted even from making the accusation. Their accusation was not legally admissible in court.
Roman law.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that would be infamia, of course, is sort of getting at someone's fame or reputation, and that would be characteristic of a lot of traditional Roman law. And he does see more of a move during this period toward, clearly defined punishments such as beheading, which doesn't mean, though, that the infamia just went away.
Right.
It was still part of the tradition. Yeah. Well, okay, so we can come back to some of that, but here I'll just continue the summary. The next major topic is marriage and virginity. And one of the major questions that arose in the 4th century, in tandem with the rise of monasticism in the desert, first in Syria, Egypt, Palestine, but then moving from there to the west, was is marriage, what is the value of marriage compared to the monastic life or the virginal life? Now, that's already sort of hinted at, or the issue is raised already in 1 Corinthians 7, right? And we talked about that, where St. Paul says, I would that all were as I am. But it's kind of a limited context because he's clearly thinking there of the imminent return of Christ. And so it's not entirely clear how you just extrapolate from that. And there elsewhere, of course, as we know, Ephesians 5, a passage that's very positive and there's a very deep theology of marriage and the value of marriage as an image of the relationship between the church and Christ. Well, so this kind of came to a head in the 380s and 390s. There was someone named Jovinian who made the audacious claim, apparently, that married Christians and virgins can achieve equal virtue, which you might almost think, well, isn't that it's almost maybe a no-brainer? But it was not at the time. In fact, just the opposite. He stirred up a lot of controversy and was attacked by Jerome, St. Jerome.
Didn't take much.
Yeah, right. Well, Jerome, when he attacks, he doesn't let go. So, Jovin. Yeah, you didn't want to get on the bad side of Jerome because he was one of those people. He spent all day on the internet just firing off flaming emails. And so,
he was a troll on Reddit.
But one that actually translated the whole Bible.
Yeah. Anyway, so Jovinian was condemned in 393. And at least in the West, and as far as I know, and you may know more about this than I do, because he doesn't go into a lot of detail, but this seemed to have been a controversy mainly in the West. And it seemed to kind of segue then into another point he mentions, which is that in the 5th century, then you start to see codified the requirement for clerical celibacy in the West, which of course didn't happen in the East. And I wish he had gone into that a little more, frankly, but that is one way in which this sort of superior valuation of the celibate life was codified into canon law in the West. And
there's several influences there. One is the predominance of Manichaees, which was imperially permitted as a religion, and there was a lot of Manichaeans who, Manichaeans decried matter, they decried sexuality, they decried marriage, all of those. And they had a lot of influence in the government and in high places. Augustine was, for instance, a Manichaean. Not really, but he was somewhat of a Manichaean before he converted. So there was a lot of influence there, which put a real damper on the question of marriage and sex. And then for clerical celibacy, one of the big questions was after the collapse of the Roman Empire, there was no clear property rights laws for the question of when there's a church and the priest of that church dies, what happens to the property of that church? Because it was generally assumed to be held by the priest or the bishop. And so that emphasized a lot of the clerical celibacy, that a priest can't have an inheritor, so that the church can't be inherited down the family as property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's worth remembering that the period we're talking about, when we talk 5th century, that is the fall of the empire in the West. And that doesn't come up much, but it's always important to remember as some of the background. He does mention, getting back to Augustine, that Augustine does have a more positive theology of marriage. He has a tract called On the Goods of Marriage, in which he identifies 3 goods of marriage. So this is going beyond, you remember last time we talked about people like Clement of Alexandria, who sort of said, well, we Christians marry just for procreation. But they didn't necessarily mean that to be final or definitive. It was more of a brief aside in the context. So Augustine treats this more systematically, and he says there are 3 goods of marriage. The first one is fidelity, the relationship of faithfulness that is itself a virtue that's worth cultivating. The second one is procreation. And the third one is what he calls sacred bond. In other words, I presume that is the sense that marriage is a sacrament and the sort of thing that St. Paul is indicating in Ephesians 5. So Augustine, points to all 3 of those. Now, in a minute, I'll come back to Augustine because he does have some things to say about sex in marriage that are a little more negative. But Anyway, there's at least a sort of the beginning of a positive theology of marriage developing. Another point, let's see, that comes up, and this was interesting to me. He makes the claim, I'm not sure I'm convinced of this, but he says that Christians adopted the practice of monogamy, the emphasis on monogamy, more from existing Roman practice than from Judaism. Yeah, you didn't think so either?
I don't buy it at all.
Yeah. Well, he never mentions the book of Genesis. Doesn't mention the Gospels. And what Christ says in the Gospels about marriage. So,
and not just that, but
therefore it is written.
For how many centuries had polygamy been not part of the Jewish tradition?
Yeah. I don't know the answer specifically.
I don't either, but I know it's many centuries.
A long time. Yeah. Right. So that didn't seem to be very persuasive. But
that's one of Jesus' critiques against the Samaritan woman.
Right.
Is this polygamy?
Polygamy.
Yeah.
Literally.
Serially.
Yeah, serial polygamy, but still. Right. However, something he says I think is probably more on target. He says that they did sort of adopt from Roman culture the ideal of marriage as the focus of one's private relationships. In other words, the sense that it's within marriage that one finds, to the extent one does find it, worldly happiness. And, what we would call, finding your soulmate. That would be an exaggeration for the Romans, but there was some sense of that. And, as we've discussed, they wrote romances. They invented the genre.
He did contrast, one thing I tracked him on, he did contrast the sort of Jewish clan view as opposed to the Roman view. And that seems to make some sense, at least in the urban environment Christianity is spreading in.
I've read this in other books. I don't know if he mentioned it here, but there was a sense among the elite, at least during the time of Augustine, which would have been the early 5th century, among the Roman elite, that there was a sense of you would have a spouse, which would be for legitimate procreation. You would also have another woman, a consort on the side, which may not have even been a sexual relationship, but that was more for interpersonal interactions, for academic kind of interchanges. And then the third would be that layer of prostitution or slavery, in which you would actually have kind of three distinct focuses of the male-female relationship, which would be broken apart into these different relationships. And it wasn't necessarily presumed that the same person would be all three of these, right? If you had certain sexual desires, you would go to the prostitute. You wouldn't go to your wife with those things. If you had an academic interest, you might go to the women of the court and have a conversation with them and have a very fulfilling intellectual relationship. But it wasn't expected that the same person, in this case a woman, be the fulfiller of all three of those. But Christianity collapses that, particularly in Augustine. We see all of these, that the marriage as this sacred bond, the vinculo sacramentum, really just collapses all of these three categories. And that, first of all, any inordinate sexual desires you're not supposed to have at all. So you wouldn't even bring those into the marriage, you just don't do them at all. But then within this kind of sacramental relationship, you can have a much deeper bond than was, which is why he uses the word bond. It literally means slave, vinculo, the chains that you're bound with. But that kind of a bond was not really expected of in that time period, but is now under Christianity.
Although one point, that's all true, but Harper does make the point, I think in the first chapter, that the pagan world was in some ways moving toward that itself.
It was.
Right? Plutarch, for instance, writes a book called the Eroticos that's all about sort of drawing eros into marriage and making the love within marriage a properly erotic love.
Yeah, I think if I wanted to stress anything, it's not necessarily the uniqueness of this to Christianity, but the distinct emphasis that under which this idea of the sacrament of marriage can actually embody this movement in a unique way that the pagan culture could not.
Yeah. Although, and it's interesting, and Father mentioned this last week, I think, that although, for us it's obvious that marriage is a sacrament. But the development of the marriage rite was pretty slow. And throughout most of this period, people still followed the old practice. There's a name for this that I forget. Where, the marriage rite consisted in the bride being led by her family to the house of the groom in this sort of raucous procession, accompanied with the ribald songs and all that, dirty jokes. And it was only gradually, apparently, and Father, you may want to comment too, that apparently people wanted their marriage to be blessed by the priest, okay? Not necessarily there at the time, right? You don't want the priest there while you're singing these dirty songs. But they would ask the priest to come around the next day or what have you. Mm-hmm. And that gave the clergy some leverage to say, well, if I'm going to bless your marriage, then you need to do this, this, and this. Mm-hmm. And over time it developed into what we can think of as the marriage rite, but it was a very slow process.
Right. Which is why there's two services.
Right,
Exactly. If you follow a modern Orthodox wedding or the Latin wedding in France, they have returns to this one custom. That before the marriage you have the rite of betrothal, which outlines the requirements for what a marriage must have. And then you acquire the marriage, and then you come back for a blessing of that marriage. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't received the rite of betrothal, you can't receive the marriage blessing.
Yeah. By the way, there's still a problem this day. In certain places, priests will not go to receptions.
Yeah.
Similar problem.
Oh, yeah. Well, I understand.
One of them was Bush. Yeah.
I think that's been known to happen even around here sometimes. Yeah.
You think?
I know Solzhenitsyn, at the beginning of August 1914, there's a scene there of a traditional Russian marriage that I think no priest would have wanted to be present at some of the goings on. So, yeah, these things.
Would have enjoyed it.
Pardon me?
Rasputin might have enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yes. Not the priest you want. Relating to that, the issue of divorce. This is something where there was a large transformation that took place over a couple of hundred years. Certainly not all at once. But in Roman law, there was a right of unilateral divorce, which is a little surprising if you think of it. That women were subordinate in many other ways, but the wife could divorce her husband at will. And I think I mentioned earlier, going with that they kept their property separate, so that if she did divorce her husband, she kept her dowry and any of the property. In fact, they were legally prohibited from giving gifts to one another. Would that be strange? But that was in order not to blur those lines of what belonged to who. Well, some of us are thinking that. Some of this Roman law sounds pretty good, doesn't it?
No more Hallmark.
We need to erase that part of the tape. Okay, so Constantine restricted this practice of unilateral divorce, but he still allowed it for various legitimate causes, and also retained the double standard regarding adultery. Okay, or maybe you might even say he instituted the double standard, because previously either party could divorce for any reason, but now the adultery of the wife was a legitimate reason for the husband to divorce, but the adultery of the husband not a legitimate reason for the wife to divorce.
And this is enshrined in Basil's canon, actually.
I was going to, yeah.
It's not something we follow, but
Mm-hmm. Several canons state that if a wife is caught in adultery, a wife of a priest, he must divorce her.
Even of a layman in Basil's canons, it's not restricted to the priesthood.
Right. So practically, I don't think it's, I've not heard of any bishop insisting upon that.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
it's not a very common thing, honestly.
Yeah. Well, he did mention that, and that's rather extreme, isn't it? So there was definitely a mismatch between civil law and church law, but more, I think, working towards some kind of a convergence. What developed during the 5th century, 449, I forget which emperor this was, but that the wife may divorce the husband if he's a flagrant adulterer, or if he beats her regularly. Okay. And then 542, this is Justinian, broadens that allowance for adultery so that pretty well, it sounded, as far as I could tell, that pretty well any case of adultery on either side could justify divorce. And the other thing he did was that he prohibited divorce by mutual consent. which,
No fault divorce.
yeah, what we would call no-fault divorce, and which had just been assumed up till that point, because that too was a traditional part of Roman law. And so there I think you see the Christian influence very strongly, that it was a Christian idea that no, marriage is for life. And that goes back to the teaching of Christ in the gospel. And it took, more than 200 years after the conversion of Constantine for that to become Roman law. The last section then, he groups together two things, both relating to free will, but in very different ways. One in the West, one in the East. So in the West, there's the Pelagian controversy that breaks out. Nathaniel, I'm sure you know the year, or at least close. You remember when it broke out?
The first council was 415.
415?
It broke out a little earlier than that. I think the Jerusalem Council was 413.
Okay. Yeah, so early 400s, toward the end of Augustine's life, it was one of the last major controversies where he went full bore and wrote prolifically about that. What Harper draws from that, he sees it as a point at which the Western Church took a step back from the perhaps naive belief in free will that we've talked about in the previous chapter, which was always part of what set Christian belief apart from the pagan world, this strong belief that we are free and therefore we are responsible and accountable before God. Well, Augustine doesn't deny that, of course, but he does, at least according to Harper, say a little more realistically, well, wait a minute, the will is what he calls a faculty lodged in the flesh and disobedient to reason. And Augustine sees sexual desire as particularly indicative of that, the fact that our sexual members don't even always obey the will or our rational desire. And so the will is...
As evidence of that, he puts forward things like nocturnal emissions. He puts forward... He doesn't even think the whole act of sex with its various emotions was something intended by God. That something could be done just very simply by an act of the will. If you wanted to procreate, you would procreate in a single act of the will without any kind of romance or other types of words that I prefer not to use.
Is that a physical act?
It would be a physical act. Forgive my baseness. There would be a single act of penetration, and then by the act of the will, ejaculation would occur without any motion, and that would be the conclusion of the sexual act.
So it's just copulation.
There's no adjoining for Augustine. What God intended was not something that the word that he uses, which translates very well in English, is libido. There's no libido in the prelapsarian sexual act, but that God did design sex and that it is good, which is a very, very important point. It's not that sex is bad. It's just that it's been corrupted by our Savior.
Yeah, well, at least the way Harper...
None of that's canonical.
Yeah.
That's the speculations of the theologian.
This is his view.
Yeah.
But very influential.
Yeah.
No, but if I remember right, the wife of Bath complains about all this in Chaucer. She really doesn't like theologians. What Harper says in Augustine is that it ends up then that sexual desire in our current fallen state is inevitably sinful, even within marriage. Although that doesn't follow that therefore the intercourse is sinful. And Augustine says if the intercourse has a procreative intent, then it's free of sin. But otherwise, apparently, even in marriage, it's still a venial sin.
That is a really important point, actually, because it's a venial sin because it's not an act of the will, right? Your body will not cooperate with what you desire it to do, which is to procreate. And therefore, you have no other option but to stir up these desires. And so it's not a mortal sin in the sense that I've chosen to be lustful, but in order to accomplish the good, I have to convince myself, so to speak.
Well, it'd be interesting to know what connection this has to the Roman Catholic teaching on contraception. Where any means that interfere with the procreative capacity of the sexual act are forbidden.
Always open to life.
Yeah, has to remain open to life.
Right.
And so I think there probably is a connection, although how direct it is, I don't know. But anyway, Augustine is emphasizing that idea that there has to be some kind of procreative intent. And that maybe intent just means openness in this context. I would think probably so.
To kind of describe the way he deals with it on the three goods of marriage, which is an excellent text, which if you're interested in this topic more, you should read it. He proposes that when a couple is no longer of childbearing age, that they see sexual actions altogether.
Which, by the way, this would not be a popular view in contemporary Orthodox parish life. Just so you know, this is not. These are theologians speaking, and I'm not poo-pooing that at all. But it's simply, don't imagine that's the contemporary,
Nobody's
realized teaching in our church.
Standing around with a stick.
Yeah.
Ready to hit you and do something wrong.
Yeah, probably never became canon law even in the West.
No,
I don't
it
think
did
much less the East, right? So,
The limits of pastoral possibilities.
yeah.
These are Christian philosophers just kind of thinking through the topics.
These are men.
That is also true. That is also true.
Mostly single men.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yes.
My mother is going to listen to this. Hi, Mom.
Augustine's actually an interesting case, though.
Yes.
Because
He had a sexual relationship.
Of all the theologians, he probably understands a relationship better than most.
Well, he kept his mistress and supported her.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as long as his mother would let him, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Strong woman. She must be.
Yeah, I think he only got rid of her because he got engaged to the 10-year-old.
Yeah.
But he could not maintain his continence, so he acquired another liaison. And then after that, he chose to become a Christian and took up the celibate life. But my point is that although he is a man, and we ought to put that on the table, deservedly, he is at least someone who understands some of the complexities of these relationships. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take them contextually within his time and within the thought that's appropriate to that.
Mm-hmm.
But at least he has some more knowledge personally than others would have.
Do you remember, was the treatise on the good of marriage written before the Pelagian controversy? Or if you don't remember that, you think it was? Yeah. So there may be sort of...
It's response to the Manichaeans, right?
Yeah.
It's part of his anti-Manichaean works because the Manichaeans are decrying marriage altogether, and he's saying no. I mean, this is the whole point of his work, is to say no. Marriage and sex are actually goods created by God, which is why when we look back at it, we see these kinds of things written by a man and so forth, and we think kind of how oppressive, but you have to realize what he's doing in this context. He's people that are saying that marriage and sex is completely evil and should be avoided altogether, and he's actually defending them, right? So that's really the Dr.
Hunter.
Thank
David
you.
Hunter, yeah.
Actually wrote an article on this very point that a lot of people think of him as very negative on sex and marriage, but that's not the case. He's actually trying to argue for its goodness.
Yeah, by the way, one of the leading scholars of this whole issue is David Hunter, who's on the faculty at UK. He wrote a book about the Jovinian controversy. He has a joint appointment of classics and history.
He's the Catholic chair.
Yeah, he's the chair of Catholic studies there.
What was that controversy for those of us who haven't?
Well, the Jovinian, remember I mentioned Jovinian, who was refuted by Jerome and condemned? Yeah, that controversy.
He taught that the married life could be as sacred as the monastic life.
Yeah, well, at least according to Harper, he put it in terms of one can achieve equal virtue. And I have to admit, I don't like that way of putting it, because I'm not sure there is a single scale on which virtue can be measured. 0 to 100. You scored 95, but I got 96. Hey. So I'm not, maybe Jovinian was a little more subtle than that.
If I may offer one pastoral word, I'm intrigued by by Harper's contention that as the church becomes more enmeshed with society, that the pastoral response is sort of this this feeling that perhaps there's less free will out there than there was before. That the capacity for human nature to really be truly free in all instances is crippled by the world, by the fall, by life. And it's interesting. I was talking to over the past years, talked to a number of priests, older priests, younger priests, and we all kind of agreed that when we're first ordained, we have this like anything is possible idea. Truly almost heroic kind of views about doing things and fulfilling the gospel perfectly. But what's interesting is in almost every case, even people that have maintained a great sanctity in their lives, but as pastors, like living their lives, you almost come to accept that there are some people that have a heart, their wills are so paralyzed by things that it does shape your pastoral vision a little bit. And I know just my gut instinct about free will is much less now than it was when I was first ordained. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's bad.
I think it's important actually to look at Augustine a slightly different way. He is not at all concerned with limiting the will, although he would certainly talk about limitations to the power of the will. But everyone was on board with that, east and west, right? That there may be things that we choose to do that we can't do. I would very much like to be a millionaire, but I'm not one, right? So just because we can choose to do things does not mean we have the power to do so. But that's really uncontroversial. What Augustine is forced to do throughout both the baptismal controversy and the Pelagian controversy is that he's forced to, for the first time in Christian history, come up with a detailed, comprehensive anthropology of human will. And this is where Dr. Bradshaw talks about what he came up with was particularly the will as a faculty of arbitration, of choosing between things. Okay, and it's something that we humans have. We see multiple things and we choose between them. And that this was his sense of the will. Well, as soon as you describe the will in this way, there is a sense in which a will can behave rightly and wrongly, which of course for Augustine, he wants to say that because there are sinful choices and there are virtuous choices, right? But it also kind of collapses because there is a way to behave rightly and a way to behave wrongly, and any rational thinking person will do the one that's rational. And the only reason you would ever choose the one that's sinful is because you have a defective humanity. Exactly. Right? So this is kind of the context in which the drawback, you might say, on the freedom of the will occurs. Is not that he's denying free will, but rather that he's having to, in a very distinct way, answer the question, what does it mean for humans to have a free will? How do we describe what it means for humans to make willful choices? And that requires a whole anthropology.
Yeah. Well, it does. It takes you right into some very difficult philosophical issues, and to add to the complexity, you have to keep track of what Augustine is saying in Latin versus what the Greek fathers are saying in Greek, because their terms don't always match up.
You also have to keep track of what Augustine is saying in Latin versus what he's saying in the English translation of Latin.
Oh yes, well,
the English translations of Augustine are notoriously wrong.
I mean, for what it's worth. I notice when I read, I have one of these wonderful little editions from the UBS where you've got the Greek text on one page and the Vulgate translation on the opposite page of the New Testament. And if you just read along in that, well, one thing that leaps out to me is that the word voluntas, which is the Latin word for will, is all over the place in the Latin New Testament, where you have 3 or 4 different Greek words, all being translated by that single Latin word or its cognate terms. And so the impression you get if you read the New Testament in Latin is that there's this thing called the voluntas that is sort of the most important thing about what I am. It's really what makes me who I am, and it's either good or it's evil and so forth. And in Greek you just don't see that because there's prohairesis, there's thelesis, there's an act is voluntary when it's hekusion, and other words as well. There's evdokia, when the angels sing at the birth of Christ, peace on earth, goodwill toward men. The Greek word there is evdokia, And that's in the doxology, right? So you sing that at the beginning of the liturgy in any Greek church. But that's bona voluntas in the Latin, goodwill, right? So anyway, I think that's partly also what's going on here, is that we're talking different vocabularies that sort of group things in different ways, and has led to a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of mutual incomprehension over the years, over the centuries. Well, let me wrap up what's in this chapter, and I think all this we can come back to. But yeah, so I found this really interesting how he groups these two things together that I never would have linked. There's the Pelagian controversy in the West, where an Augustine's new idea of the will is intrinsically fallen and sinful. And then in the East, it's not a theological controversy at all. It's the practical issue of the prostitutes. And how are they to be handled pastorally? And St. Basil draws a distinction in his canons. He says that some prostitutes are in sin by necessity. Okay, in other words, they're slaves. Yeah. And they're forced to do this by their masters. And he says they are not responsible for that sin.
But Augustine actually has the same distinction in the City of God, where he's talking about this is the collapse of the Roman Empire now, and the barbarians have come in and raped and looted. And one of the major questions after this is, are these women who have been raped still virgins? The nuns in particular, are they still virgins? And Augustine says it very plainly, yes, they are, because they were of necessity. It was not an act of their will.
Yeah. Well, so Basil's not going quite that far. And that actually is another example of this sort of, centrality of the will in Western thought. So Basil doesn't put it at the theoretical level like that, but he does say pastorally and canonically that they are without blame. And the interesting thing is that actually finds its way, in a sense, into Roman law, because he traces through here the gradual process by which prostitution was eliminated, or at least prohibited. In 428, there was a law, I forget again which emperor, that sort of took Basil's view and applied it, and said that prostitutes have the right to appeal against their pimp to a judge or a bishop. And if the pimp resists that determination, that the pimp would be sold to the mines. So,
and the fact that you could appeal that to the bishop is really a powerful thing.
I mean, this is huge.
Imagine
Yeah.
if a prostitute came in and did the same thing with Father Justin. Now, which side are you likely to side on? For the most part, you'd be siding with the prostitute.
Yeah, so we're talking slaves. Most of the prostitutes are slaves who have the right of appeal under law to go to the judge or the bishop and accuse their master. So it really is revolutionary. However, it was not yet the complete revolution, because prostitution was still legal and the state was drawing taxes from that. Okay? Doesn't this sound familiar? Okay. And they needed the money. So it took another 100 years. The emperors gradually, step by step, sort of weaned themselves away from that tax money. First of all, saying, we're not going to tax this, we're not going to tax this, and that opened the door for Justinian then. And Justinian was really interesting too, because his wife Theodora probably had been a prostitute herself. She was a member of a theatrical company. Yes, she was an actress.
Euphemism.
Yeah, perhaps. It's hard to know exactly how much is true and how much is sort of the slander that his political enemies spread. But she definitely was a member of a theatrical company, and that would have been more common than not for a beautiful young woman in her position to be a prostitute. Well, so he had a kind of, you might say, a sort of a personal interest in this. And so he commissioned an inquiry, an investigation into what was really happening out there on the streets. And were these laws, in theory, a lot of things were illegal. Were the laws being enforced? And lo and behold, they were not. The old practices were still there in full force, including slaves and women being kidnapped and taken away into prostitution, the whole 9 yards. And so he really put his foot down, and he prohibited the whole practice, top to bottom, and saw to it that that law was enforced. So that was...
And enacted protections for the women all throughout the legal system, including probably one of the most important ones, which is that a woman could not be guarded by a man. That's what would happen when the woman was alone, when nobody was looking, and the jailer was standing.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, good point. And he and Theodora also established a convent or a women's monastery just for former prostitutes. Now, in the next chapter, he's going to talk about some of the saints, like St. Mary of Egypt and St. Pelagia, who are roughly at this time and are sort of presenting the model of how even that kind of degradation does not prevent repentance and sanctity. So that's still to come. And he'll also be talking sort of about the genre of Christian romance. And, this chapter has been about the legal level, and the next chapter is going to be about the level of the imagination, because that's at least equally important. What are people thinking? What are they dreaming about? What are they aspiring to be? So that's where we'll be going. So that's sort of the bird's eye view. Did you want to come back to anything, or?
I find the story really compelling, the contrast kind of between Theodora, who was probably a woman of ill repute of some sort, and this story. By the way, it's St. Theodora's name. We're celebrating her. So, in contrast with the story, I don't remember where it was mentioned in the first recording which I listened to, which was it was the story of the woman. The philosophers were arguing this, whether the woman who had kept herself from sexuality by a deceit in the monastery or in the brothel was able to have...
Right, it was a rhetorical exercise. Right, and students could write on either side of this.
Yeah, and I find these two stories kind of a very interesting contrast, that Christianity kind of provides and answers this puzzle, this philosophical puzzle, that a woman can, in fact, retain her virtue through repentance. Right, where it's not necessarily that you have to maintain completely pure from deceit or completely pure from sexuality, but that our purity actually comes through repentance and changing your life.
Well, for the Romans, the issue was one of honor.
Yes.
Right, and Christianity, honor is no longer central in the way it was for the pagans. In fact, there's an essay by Peter Berger, who's a sociologist, that I find a little depressing. It's called "The Obsolescence of the Concept of Honor." And he doesn't pin this just on Christianity, but he sees it as a feature of modern Western culture that the concept of honor, is obsolete. Now, that was not yet true at this time we're talking about, but it was definitely sort of moving away from center stage where it had been. And much more important was, your relationship to God. And that's the central thing for Christianity, that if you repent, that relationship can always be repaired and renewed, no matter what you've done. So,
this discussion has made me realize that we're having a snapshot of a certain time in history, which was the transition from paganism to Christianity and the attitudes on these subjects. It makes me want to know how the church progressed and where we ended up. Because the little reading I've done, there are different Orthodox writers who have different points of view on these subjects.
Still.
We're saying something, this is not canonical, it's just one person's opinion, But where we are canonically and what surrounds that, the opinion that surrounds it, would be very interesting. I don't know how we get at that, but it's an interesting question.
I think about Father Alexander Schmeman's kind of his catechesis that he uses, and in which he talks about the different sources of tradition, right? And we have our scriptures, we have our liturgy, we have the canonical corpus, right? The councils and such. We have the church fathers. We have church art. We have all these different things. And someone mentioned last week that the marriage rite is rich, and there's sort of a voluptuous quality to it that's beautiful and Old Testament-y. And then you have certain canons that would indicate something different. Then you find other canons that say something different than that. And then you go to Elvira and they say something, and then the ecumenical canons, and then you have church fathers that are all over the place. Our challenge isn't really to say, well, the church's position is like totally right here, but maybe a more helpful approach is to say, what is a range of possibilities?
And there's some important markers, I think, there.
Sure,
Right.
absolutely.
One of those markers is that sex is not just for pleasure.
Right.
Right. Which is if there's any universal statement
Amen.
in the tradition, it is that sex is not merely for human pleasure, but it has a greater purpose beyond that. And there are different articulations of what that pleasure is. I personally think that Augustine's writing on the goods of marriage is probably one of the best systematic ways of approaching it. In terms of the Latin tradition, that work completely norms the Latin marriage rites. If you've ever been to an Anglican or Roman Catholic wedding, you'll hear those three goods, right? Fidelity, procreation, sacrament, the bond of the sacrament, right? These are echoed all throughout the rite. And while that hasn't really had a whole lot of influence in the East, and the East never really read that text, nevertheless, you still get all of those same three strands throughout a lot of the writings. And so I think Augustine is kind of systematizing something that really is very broad. And that doesn't mean we have to take everything that he says from that text. This should be understood in its historical context. But those three goods, I think, are at least worth affirming. The fidelity, procreation, and sacrament. Right. And that's kind of the contour, I think, of the shape of the tradition. Is that it's not just for pleasure, and that there's at least these three goods.
No, and to say that there's a territory, you can sort of graph it, doesn't mean that there are no limits either. There are real limits, as you indicated, and if you have specific questions about what that might be, we can talk about it. But
well, you mentioned, Father, church art or icons as one of the sources of our tradition, and I wonder, have you all seen the icon of the conception of the Theotokos, right? And it shows their marriage bed, and then they're embracing,
their loving embrace,
in a very
tender embrace.
So with the marriage bed sort of behind them, and the title of it is the conception of the Theotokos, right? And I had a friend, I tell you the truth, I'd seen that icon and it kind of hadn't struck me, but this friend who was Orthodox, who was a convert, a recent convert, said that icon had saved their marriage because his wife had never been able to sort of enter into sex with a willing spirit, you might say, until they became Orthodox, and that icon opened that door for her. And so I was interested by that. So things are conveyed. Pardon me?
What tradition had they come out of?
It was something Protestant, but I don't know exactly.
That icon actually brings up another kind of universal of the tradition, which is that both East and West, Greek and Latin, there are very strong statements that marriage, that conception was not a conception of lust. That it was not driven by this kind of basest human desire, but it was an act of love, a desire for a child, even asking God for a child. And that's, in the Latin tradition, that ultimately becomes the Immaculate Conception, right? And we've not codified that, but it is nonetheless an important universal that we are actually looking at an image of a good and proper marriage, one that is desiring for mutual affection, fidelity, procreation, and a desire to image God's creation in the act of marriage.
I thought the Immaculate Conception was more sort of a mystical thing that the Theotokos has no original sin.
The backdrop to that is Augustine's teaching that original sin is passed on by concupiscence, by libido.
Yeah.
It's that lust in the sexual act that passes on the original sin. And so that's a theological conclusion they come to out of that. But the much earlier Latin tradition, and the tradition we also uphold, is that it was not a relationship driven by lust. It was not one which desired to produce a child out of a desire for pleasure, but it was one out of a godly desire to have children. And that's really what that icon images.
Before we all disperse, I did want to, I found this point really interesting on page 147. Harper seems to indicate, I'm going to read this and then we can comment on it. This is the very bottom of page 146, last sentence. Pre-Christian ideologies treated sexual deviance, even deviance involving same-sex attraction, as a matter of excessive desire and insufficient manliness. There was no queer desire. I mean, I'm wondering, like gay identity,
Right.
I don't know. Only desire overflowing its proper bounds. In Chrysostom, we see how the logic of excess begins to give way to a sense that this excessive desire was, in its very essence, strange. Now, he seems to be arguing it's Christianity that kind of helps set the. And I'm tracking with him, I think, for this idea of a kind of a queer identity or gay identity that is so common nowadays, and that your friend Brian Patrick Mitchell wrote about in an article recently. I don't know. Do y'all want to comment on that? I don't know. I find this interesting because so much of what I hear pastorally from other priests about what they're hearing in their parishes from parishioners and what we're reading is, someone comes and says, this is my identity, this is my core. It isn't simply a desire I have. It is rather a part of a core identity. And this seems to be something somewhat new, at least in our culture, but are the roots here, and how might we untangle it some? I don't have an answer. I find this to be an interesting point.
Well, I think, at least as far as Chrysostom goes, and he goes on in the next paragraph to quote from Chrysostom's homily, the desire isn't innate and it's not unalterable. Now, it may be very strong and it may be deeply ingrained, right? But Chrysostom thinks that's itself a product. See, this is the old view that goes back to Aristotle, that we shape our habitual desires by the actions we freely perform. And so, for Aristotle, either a virtue or a vice is a kind of a habit. It's the habit of responding in a certain way to certain situations or challenges. So the vice of being excessively angry is something that grows up. It's the habit that forms as I let my temper go repeatedly, and pretty soon I just do it habitually without even thinking. It's just second nature. And conversely, the virtue of being gentle and well-tempered is the same sort of thing. And he thinks that process begins, as small children, and that's one reason that parents are so important, is that they are the ones shaping their children's habits and character at that young age. So anyway, I think that's the common view of the ancient world, that our desires, even though as strong as they are, they're still something that is malleable over the long term. Not immediately, but over the long term. And I think Chrysostom probably, if I understood him here, is...
which is actually what modern queer theory says. What was coming out in the 70s and 80s was very much this idea of a specific identity that was unchangeable and malleable. And really now, they like to talk much more in terms of spectrums. Right, so you may have a strong desire from 0 to 10. You may have desire for men, for women, 0 to 10 for something else, and that over your life, these desires wax and wane in different ways. And really, I think this is a sensible recognition of the traditional Christian tradition.
I was going to say that sensibility that I received in the seminary, for whatever that's worth.
Mm-hmm. Well, the ancients were definitely aware that sexual desire has a life of its own. And the things that happen to you perhaps when you're young, can shape you in ways that are very deep. And because Plato, actually in the Gorgias, he mentions the case of a catamite. That was the word they used for a boy who was raised as a male, sexual slave. And he says, well, so isn't it the case that catamites come to enjoy what they do? And so they were well aware of that because, it's what they've grown up in, what this poor child has grown up in, the only thing he's known and the source of the only pleasures he's had in life. And that's, how can you overcome something like that? Plato wouldn't even have tried, but Christianity believes that there is radical redemption. And there's divine grace that can do things that none of us can do otherwise. So,
I have a question. Does he say anything about the book about specifically the role of children? I know from the first few sections, it was very clear that children would be abandoned and raised in these sexualized conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously we have this teaching of Christ: if anyone harms one of these little ones that believes in me, it'd be better for a millstone to be tied around his neck and thrown into the deepest ocean.
Yeah.
Right? Which is a very strong teaching about the offending of a child. Is there any sort of protection for children that arises in this period? That's something I've not read a lot of.
Yeah. We talked about that some last week. I don't think Harper says a lot, except sort of by implication, because, of course, a lot of these prostitutes were children who'd been abandoned and then raised by slave traders for this very purpose. And so any attack on prostitution is thereby also a step forward in terms of how children are treated.
There was the case by Tertullian, or the Tertullian brought, about the man and the woman who had the son who was given over to the slaves to raise him, and was stolen away and sold into slavery, and then consequently bought by the father and used, because that identity, the identity of this child as a slave, was not a non-person. I mean, there's this could not recognize it,
Yeah.
because
because it was an
the
object
one
of
before was
desire
an object
rather than a person.
and not a person, and it took the slaves who were objects to actually recognize the son and bring it back to the father. So
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, you even have, I don't know if this was mentioned, you have some of the earliest writings against slavery in this period as well.
He mentions Gregor of Nyssa. However, don't forget, there are plenty of fathers who are very positive about slavery too. And Basil is especially interesting to me because there's a chapter in Basil's on the Holy Spirit, you probably read this, that's all about slavery, and that slavery is a form of a good that's given to us by God. And it enables those who have reason to guide and direct those who are lacking in reason. Now that's not original to Basil. That's the view of Plato in the Republic. That's sort of there in Basil, but there's also in his Moralia this teaching that he follows. He kind of repeats what St. Paul says about slaves: obey your masters as is fitting in the Lord, and so on. But then he adds, unless your master commands you to do something that is against the law of God. And that's where you draw a line. And he's very emphatic about that too. So even for someone like Basil, there are definite limits.
That's a good point. In another article which I've read, and I completely forget what it is now, the thesis of the article was that while many Christians of this period did support slavery, it bore with it these very significant conditions, right? That you should obey your master, but not when he commands you to do something that breaks the law of God. And that what ends up happening by the time of particularly the 12th, 13th century, is that slavery has just become so unwieldy because there's so many regulations to it, to make sure that you treat the slaves properly and all these things, that it's just kind of gradually abandoned and ultimately gets written against as something evil. But it's really just because Christianity puts so many limitations on slavery that it makes it kind of ineffectual as an institution.
And it did take a long time.
Yeah.
That's 1,000 years. But that is correct, I think. And we are.